The scorching sun beat down on the New Mexico territory like an anvil, casting the wasteland in a merciless glow that made even the rattlesnakes seek refuge. It was 1875, and the parched desert seemed determined to claim another victim as Sarah Evans stumbled forward, her cracked lips mouthing silent prayers while her once fine traveling dress hung in tatters around her slim frame. 3 days without proper water had turned her world into a hazy mirage of suffering. The stagecoach robbery had left her the sole survivor, abandoned to the desert's cruel embrace after the bandits took everything of value including the water canteens. Her honey-blonde hair, once neatly pinned, now fell in dusty tangles around her sunburnt face as she fought to put one foot in front of the other. "Just one more mile," Sarah whispered, though she had no idea where she was headed. The distant mountains hadn't seemed to grow any closer despite hours of walking. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her vision swam with black spots that expanded and contracted with each labored heartbeat. When her knees finally buckled beneath her, Sarah didn't even feel the impact of hitting the ground. The world tilted sideways as she collapsed into the sand, her consciousness fading into blessed darkness. Her last thought was of her sister in Tahlequah, waiting for a reunion that might never come. Miles away, Mason Owens spotted something unusual through his spyglass, a splash of color against the endless browns and reds of the desert floor. He lowered the brass instrument, narrowed his eyes, and tugged gently on the reins of his sturdy Palomino Samson. "What do you make of that, boy?" he asked, patting the horse's neck. Mason wasn't a man given to talking much, but out here with only his horse for company, he'd developed the habit. 6 years as a bounty hunter had taught him caution, but something about that distant shape pulled him forward. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into the unmistakable form of a woman. Mason spurred Samson into a gallop, dust kicking up behind them as they closed the distance. When he reached her side, he dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Madam," he called, kneeling beside her motionless form. When she didn't respond, Mason gently turned her over, taking in her sunburnt skin and the parched cracks in her lips. She was alive, but barely. He could see the desperate state of dehydration in the hollows of her cheeks and the dry, papery quality of her skin. Mason reached for his canteen, unscrewing the cap. There wasn't much water left, perhaps a day's worth if he was careful, but he knew what needed to be done. Without hesitation, he lifted her head and carefully tipped a small amount of water against her lips. "Easy now," he murmured as she instinctively swallowed. "Just a little at first." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Mason found himself looking into eyes the color of a summer sky. Something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. "Where?" She managed, her voice a painful rasp. "You're safe now, madam," Mason replied, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "I'm Mason Owens. I found you collapsed in the desert." "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Evans." "Well, Miss Evans, you're in a bad way. We need to get you somewhere with shade and rest." He offered her another small sip of water. "This is all I have until we reach water again. Might be a day's ride." Sarah's gaze fixed on the canteen, then shifted to Mason's face, comprehension dawning in her eyes. You're giving me your water." Mason's weathered face softened slightly. "I'll trade my water before I lose you," he said, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. Something about her pulled at him, a vulnerability mixed with a strength that had kept her alive against impossible odds. The gravity of his own words hit him a moment later. He'd just met this woman, yet here he was, ready to risk his own life to save hers. 6 years of careful survival instincts, and he was breaking his most fundamental rule. Look after yourself first. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her fingers weakly closing around his wrist as she took another small sip. Mason nodded, already planning their next move. We need to get you out of this sun. My horse can carry us both to the nearest settlement if we take it slow. He paused, looking at her closely. What happened to you out here, Miss Evans? Sarah's eyes clouded with the memory. Stagecoach. Robbers, they shot everyone else. Left me here to die. Anger flashed across Mason's face. Cowards, he muttered, then more gently. Can you stand if I help you? Sarah attempted to nod but winced at the movement. I'll try. With careful movements, Mason helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as she swayed dangerously. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, the beginning stages of sun sickness. They needed shelter, and soon. I'm going to lift you onto Samson now, he explained, gesturing to his patient horse. Then I'll climb up behind you. You just focus on staying conscious, all right? All right, Sarah agreed, her voice barely audible. With practiced ease, Mason lifted her onto his saddle, noting how light she felt in his arms, too light. He mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist to keep her from falling. There's a place about half a day's ride from here, he told her, urging Samson forward at a gentle pace. Man named Jefferson runs a trading post. He'll have water and a place for you to rest. Sarah leaned back against Mason's chest, too weak to maintain her posture. Why? She asked after a moment of silence. Why what? Why help me? You don't know me, you're water. Mason was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. The honest answer surprised even him. Been riding these lands for 6 years now. Seen a lot of death. Too much. Guess I wasn't ready to see yours. As they rode, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Mason kept one eye on the horizon and one on the woman in his arms, offering her tiny sips of water whenever she stirred. By midday, his canteen was half empty, and he'd had none himself. His own throat felt like scorched earth, but he ignored it. He'd gone thirsty before. The trading post appeared like a mirage on the horizon as the afternoon wore on a squat, adobe building surrounded by a crude wooden fence. A windmill turned lazily above a precious well, the sight of it nearly bringing tears to Mason's eyes. We made it, Miss Evans, he said, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. Water's just ahead. Jefferson, a grizzled man with one eye and a perpetual scowl, emerged from the trading post as they approached, shotgun in hand until he recognized Mason. Owens, he acknowledged, lowering the weapon. Who's the lady? Found her in the desert, Mason explained, dismounting carefully before lifting Sarah down. Stagecoach robbery. She needs water, food, and rest. Jefferson's good eye widened slightly. Robbery, eh? The Decker boys have been hitting the stage routes lately. Nasty business. He stepped aside, holding the door open. Bring her in. My Maggie can help her get cleaned up. Inside the trading post, Jefferson's wife, a kind-faced woman with strong hands, took charge immediately, helping Sarah to a back room while Mason filled his canteen at the well, drinking deeply for the first time in hours. You look half dead yourself, Jefferson commented, handing Mason a cup of whiskey. How long you been without water? Not as long as she has, Mason replied, accepting the drink gratefully. She's been out there at least 3 days by my reckoning. Jefferson whistled low. 3 days in this heat. She's got the constitution of a mule. Mason smiled faintly. Seems that way. After settling his bill for supplies and arranging for Sarah to have a place to rest for the night, Mason stepped outside to tend to Samson. He was brushing the horse's coat when the door opened behind him. Mr. Owens. He turned to find Maggie Jefferson standing in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. The young lady's asking for you. She's resting, but she's awake. Mason nodded, setting aside the brush. Thank you, Mrs. Jefferson. Sarah was sitting propped against pillows in a small, clean bed in the corner of the Jeffersons' private quarters. Her face had been washed and her hair combed and braided. Someone had lent her a simple cotton nightgown. Even pale and exhausted, she was remarkably beautiful. "Miss Evans," Mason greeted, removing his hat as he entered. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied, her voice still weak but clearer than before. "Thanks to you." She gestured to the chair beside her bed. "Please sit." Mason complied, settling his tall frame into the small wooden chair. "Mrs. Jefferson taking good care of you." "She's been very kind," Sarah confirmed. "She says you paid for my room and board." Mason shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It was the right thing to do. Nevertheless, I'm grateful." Sarah studied his face for a moment. "You're a bounty hunter." It wasn't a question. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Jefferson tell you that?" She nodded. "He said you track the worst outlaws in the territory." Her fingers worried at the edge of the blanket, including stagecoach robbers. Understanding dawned in Mason's eyes. "You want me to find the men who attacked your coach?" "They killed 5 people, Mr. Owens. The driver, the guard, and 3 passengers. Left me to die." Her blue eyes hardened with determination. "They should answer for that." Mason leaned back in his chair, considering. "Most likely the Decker gang. They've been hitting stages between Santa Fe and Fort Sumner." He paused, watching her carefully. "Finding them won't bring back the dead, Miss Evans." "I know that," she replied quietly, "but it might stop them from killing others." She hesitated, then added, "I can pay you. When we reach Tahlequah, my sister can arrange payment. Her husband is a banker there." Mason frowned slightly. "You were headed to Tahlequah, that's Cherokee Nation territory in the Indian Territory." "Yes. My sister married and moved there 5 years ago. I was going to live with them after our father passed." Her voice caught. "Everything I owned was in my trunk on that stagecoach. All I have now is what you see before you." Mason was silent for a long moment. Taking on the Decker gang wasn't a small task. They were vicious and well armed. But the thought of them leaving this woman to die in the desert stirred something dark inside him. "Rest tonight," he finally said, rising to his feet. "We'll talk more in the morning." "Tahlequah is a long way from here, nearly 500 miles. We'll need to plan carefully." Relief washed over Sarah's face. "Thank you, Mr. Owens, for everything." Mason nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "Get some sleep, Miss Evans. Desert's out of you yet." That night, Mason slept under the stars outside the trading post, his bedroll spread beneath a juniper tree. He stared up at the vast expanse of the night sky, thinking about Sarah Evans and the strange twist of fate that had brought her into his life. 6 years he'd been alone, tracking men through deserts and mountains, bringing in bounties to scrape together a living. He told himself it was justice that drove him, but the truth was simpler and harder. After losing his family to raiders in '69, vengeance had been all that kept him moving forward. When that well ran dry, habit and solitude had become his companions. Now, looking up at the same stars that had witnessed his darkest moments, Mason found himself contemplating a different path. Taking Sarah to Tahlequah would mean weeks of travel, weeks in her company. The thought was both unsettling and oddly appealing. Morning came with the harsh clarity of the desert dawn. Mason rose before the sun, checking his supplies and readying Samson for the journey ahead. He was securing his saddle when he heard footsteps behind him. Sarah stood in the doorway of the trading post, dressed in clothes that must have been borrowed from Mrs. Jefferson, a simple blue calico dress and sturdy boots. Her hair was neatly pinned up, and some color had returned to her cheeks. "Good morning, Mr. Owens," she greeted him. Mason tipped his hat. "Miss Evans, you're looking better. I feel it." She stepped closer, eyeing his preparations. "Are we leaving today?" Mason nodded. If you're up to it. Jefferson says there's a small town called Luna about 2 days' ride from here. We can rest there before continuing east. He paused. Are you sure about this journey? It would be safer for you to take the next stagecoach to Santa Fe than catch the train east. Sarah shook her head firmly. I'm not getting on another stagecoach in this territory, not with those men still out there. Her eyes met his. Besides, I've made arrangements with you and I intend to honor them. Very well, Mason conceded, recognizing the determination in her gaze. But we'll be traveling rough. It won't be comfortable. I survived 3 days alone in the desert, Mr. Owens. I believe I can manage rough traveling conditions with a skilled guide. The hint of spirit in her voice brought a small smile to Mason's face. Fair enough. They departed the trading post an hour later, after a hearty breakfast provided by Mrs. Jefferson. Mason had purchased a second horse, a steady brown mare that Jefferson had been looking to sell so that Sarah could ride on her own. He'd also acquired proper traveling clothes for her, including a wide-brimmed hat to protect her from the sun. The mare's name is Penny, Mason explained as they set out. Jefferson says she's gentle but sturdy, should serve you well on the journey. Sarah patted the horse's neck appreciatively. Hello, Penny. It seems we'll be getting to know each other quite well. As they rode, Mason kept a careful eye on Sarah, watching for signs of fatigue or weakness, but she surprised him with her resilience. Despite her ordeal, she sat straight in the saddle, her gaze fixed firmly ahead. You ride well, he observed as they crossed a dry stream bed. My father raised horses in Virginia before the war, she explained. I grew up in the saddle. A shadow passed over her face. We lost everything in '65. Father moved us west to start over, but it was never the same. Mason nodded, understanding all too well how war had reshaped countless lives. The war changed everything for a lot of folks. Were you a soldier? She asked. Confederate cavalry, Mason replied after a moment's hesitation. Joined up in '63 when I was 18, fought until Appomattox. He didn't elaborate on what came after the difficult years of trying to rebuild in a broken landscape, only to lose everything again to raiders in '69. Sarah seemed to sense his reluctance to discuss the topic further. My father fought as well. He came home a different man. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves marking time as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Around midday, Mason called a halt in the shade of a large rock formation. We'll rest here through the worst of the heat, he announced, dismounting. No sense pushing ourselves or the horses when the sun's highest. Sarah slid gracefully from her saddle, stretching her legs. A wise decision, though I admit I'm eager to put as much distance as possible between us and where you found me. Mason understood her anxiety. The Deckers usually don't return to the same spot twice. They'll have moved on to new hunting grounds. As they shared a simple lunch of jerky and hardtack, Sarah studied Mason's profile. How did you become a bounty hunter, Mr. Owens? It seems a lonely profession. Mason took a swig from his canteen before answering. It is that, as for how, he paused, choosing his words carefully. After the war, I tried farming in Texas, had a wife, a son on the way. The memories were still sharp enough to cut. Raiders came through in '69. Comancheros selling guns to hostile tribes. When I got back from town, the farm was burning. Eleanor was gone. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Owens, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have pried. Mason shook his head. It was a long time ago. After that, I started tracking men. Found I had a talent for it. Been doing it ever since. The quiet that fell between them was heavy with shared understanding of loss. After a moment, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft. My fiancé died at Fredericksburg. I was 19. Everyone expected me to marry someone else, but she traced patterns in the dust with a stick. I never found anyone I wanted to build a life with, so I became my father's caretaker instead. Mason watched her, seeing beyond her current travel-worn appearance to the woman beneath strong, resilient, shaped by hardship but not broken by it. "And now your sister in Tahlequah," he prompted. Sarah nodded. "Catherine married a banker named William Preston. They have 2 children now, a boy and a girl. When father passed last month, she insisted I come live with them." A faint smile touched her lips. "I've never met my niece and nephew. They only know me from letters." "They'll be happy to see you," Mason said, surprised by his certainty. "Family is precious." "Yes," Sarah agreed, meeting his gaze. "It is." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. 2 people who had weathered storms and emerged scarred but standing. Mason looked away first, unaccustomed to the warmth that stirred in his chest. "We should move on," he said, rising to his feet. "Still have a few hours of daylight left." They traveled until dusk, making camp in a small arroyo that offered protection from the wind. Mason built a small fire while Sarah arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. "Will you teach me to shoot?" she asked as they ate a dinner of beans and salt pork. Mason looked up in surprise. "You don't know how?" Sarah shook her head. "Father owned guns, but he considered them men's business after what happened on the stagecoach." She squared her shoulders. "I don't want to be helpless again." Mason considered her request. "It's not a bad idea. Out here, knowing how to protect yourself is necessary." He reached for his saddlebag and pulled out his spare revolver, a well-maintained Colt. "We'll start your lessons tomorrow. For now, keep this with you." Sarah accepted the weapon carefully. "Thank you, I promise to be a quick study." As darkness settled over their camp, the vast canopy of stars emerged above them, more brilliant than any city dweller could imagine. Sarah gazed upward, wonder evident on her face despite her exhaustion. "I've never seen so many stars," she murmured. "It makes one feel very small, doesn't it?" Mason followed her gaze. "It does. But there's comfort in it too, knowing the same stars have watched over generations before us and will watch over those who come after." Sarah looked at him with a new appreciation. "You're a philosopher, Mr. Owens." A rare, genuine smile crossed Mason's face. "No, madam, just a man who's spent too many nights alone with these stars for company." "Well, tonight you're not alone," Sarah said softly, "and neither am I. Good night, Mr. Owens." "Good night, Miss Evans," Mason replied, watching as she settled into her bedroll. "Sleep well." But sleep was slow to come for Mason that night. He lay awake, listening to Sarah's steady breathing across the fire, thinking about the journey ahead and the unexpected turn his solitary life had taken. The next day brought Sarah's first shooting lesson. They stopped mid-morning in a small clearing, and Mason set up empty cans on a fallen log. "The first thing to remember is respect," Mason explained, demonstrating the proper way to hold the Colt. "This isn't a toy. It's a tool, and a deadly one." Sarah nodded seriously, paying close attention as he explained the mechanics of loading, aiming, and firing. When it came time for her to try, Mason stood behind her, adjusting her stance and grip. "Keep both eyes open," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." Sarah's first shot went wide, the recoil stronger than she'd expected, but she set her jaw determinedly and tried again. By the 5th shot, she'd hit one of the cans and her face lit up with satisfaction. "Well done," Mason approved. "You're a natural." "Hardly," Sarah laughed, "but I'll improve with practice." They continued their journey, falling into an easy rhythm together. Each night, Mason would teach Sarah something new: how to build a fire, how to read animal tracks, how to navigate by the stars. In return, She shared stories of her life in Virginia, of books she'd read, of her dreams for the future. On the evening of the second day, the small settlement of Luna appeared in the distance, a collection of perhaps 20 buildings clustered around a central street. After days in the wilderness, even this humble outpost seemed like civilization. "We'll get a proper meal and real beds tonight," Mason told Sarah as they approached. "There's a decent boarding house here." Luna's main street was quiet as they rode in, just a few locals moving about their evening business. Mason led them to a small stable at the edge of town, where they left their horses in the care of a sleepy-looking boy. "You feed them good now," Mason instructed, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. "The lady's mare needs extra attention. She's new to long rides." The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Caldwell, a brisk, efficient woman who looked Sarah and Mason over with shrewd eyes. "2 rooms," Mason said firmly, placing coins on the counter. "And information about the next stage to Santa Fe if you have it." Mrs. Caldwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "Stage comes through every Thursday. You've just missed it. Won't be another for 6 days." She eyed Sarah's trail-worn appearance. "Dining room's closed, but I can have some supper sent up if you're hungry." "That would be most appreciated," Sarah replied gratefully. In the privacy of her small but clean room, Sarah allowed herself the luxury of a proper wash with the basin of hot water Mrs. Caldwell had provided. The simple act of cleaning away the trail dust felt like restoring a piece of her dignity. A knock at her door announced the arrival of supper, a hearty stew with fresh bread. To Sarah's surprise, Mason stood in the hallway with his own tray. "Thought you might like some company," he offered, suddenly looking uncertain. "But if you'd prefer to rest." "Company would be lovely," Sarah said, opening the door wider. "Please come in." They sat by the small window, watching as Luna's few lamps were lit against the gathering darkness. The stew was simple but delicious after days of trail food, and Sarah found herself relaxing in Mason's presence. "What's your plan now?" she asked after they'd eaten in companionable silence for a while. "Will you continue escorting me to Tahlequah, or will you stay here to catch the stage to Santa Fe?" Mason considered the question. "Depends on what we learn tomorrow. If the Deckers have been through this area, I'll want to follow their trail while it's fresh." He studied her face. "But I gave my word to see you safely to your sister. You found me dying in the desert, Mr. Owens. You've already done more than most men would." Sarah set her spoon down. "If you need to pursue these outlaws, I understand. I can wait for the stage." Mason was quiet for a moment, torn between his duty as a bounty hunter and his growing sense of responsibility toward Sarah. "Let's see what tomorrow brings," he finally said. "No need to decide tonight." After Mason had bid her good night and returned to his own room, Sarah stood by the window, looking out at the stars that seemed somehow dimmer here than they had in the open desert. The thought of parting ways with Mason left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. In just 3 days, his steady presence had become a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. Morning brought news that changed their plans entirely. As they sat in the boarding house dining room over breakfast, the local sheriff entered, speaking in urgent tones to Mrs. Caldwell. Mason's attention sharpened immediately. "Excuse me," he said to Sarah, rising from the table and approaching the lawman. "Sheriff, I couldn't help overhearing. You mentioned a stagecoach robbery." The sheriff, a grizzled man with a silver mustache, eyed Mason suspiciously. "Who's asking?" Mason introduced himself, explaining his profession and Sarah's situation. The sheriff's demeanor changed immediately. "You're tracking the Deckers. Well, they hit another stage yesterday about 20 miles south of here. Killed the driver and guard, robbed the passengers." His expression darkened. But this time they took a hostage young woman traveling to visit her aunt in Albuquerque. Sarah had joined them, her face pale. They didn't. They didn't leave anyone to die in the desert this time, the sheriff shook his head. No, madam. But taking a hostage is new for them. Makes me think they're getting desperate. Army patrol's been dogging them since they crossed into military territory last week. Mason's expression was grim. Which way were they headed? Southwest, toward the Black Range. The sheriff studied Mason thoughtfully. You planning to go after them? That's my job, Mason replied simply. He turned to Sarah, conflict evident in his eyes. Miss Evans. Sarah straightened her shoulders. You have to go after them, she said firmly. That poor woman. She needs help now more than I do. The sheriff looked between them. Madam, if you're waiting for the stage, you'll be safe enough here. Luna's quiet, and I keep it that way. Thank you, Sheriff, Sarah said, though her eyes remained on Mason. May I have a word with Mr. Owens alone? When the sheriff had moved away, Sarah spoke in a low, determined voice. Go after them, Mr. Owens. Save that woman if you can. Mason stepped closer, lowering his voice. I gave you my word, Miss Evans. I don't break my promises. You promised to see me safely to Tahlequah, Sarah countered. And you will after you've done what needs to be done here. I'll wait for you. Mason searched her face. It could be dangerous. The Deckers won't be taken easily. All the more reason that woman needs someone like you to help her. Sarah's hand touched his arm briefly. I'll be fine here until you return. Then we can continue our journey together. The certainty in her voice that he would return, that they would continue together, settled something in Mason's chest. He nodded slowly. 3 days. If I'm not back by then, take the Thursday stage to Santa Fe, then the train east. 3 days, Sarah agreed. But you will come back. Mason's provisions were quickly replenished, and within an hour he was ready to depart. Sarah walked with him to the stable where Samson waited, freshly groomed and rested. Be careful, she said as Mason checked his saddle one last time. Those men have nothing to lose. All the more reason to stop them before they hurt anyone else. Mason hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small, worn compass. Keep this with you. If anything happens, if I don't come back, it might help you find your way. Sarah closed her fingers around the compass, recognizing it for what it was, not just a tool for navigation, but a piece of Mason himself. I'll keep it safe until you return, she promised. Mason mounted Samson, looking down at Sarah. For a moment, words seemed to fail him. Then, with a tip of his hat, he simply said, 3 days, Miss Evans. 3 days, Mr. Owens, she echoed, stepping back as he turned Samson and rode out of Luna, following the trail of men who had left her to die in the desert. The boarding house felt stifling after the openness of the trail, but Sarah made herself useful during Mason's absence, helping Mrs. Caldwell with mending and cooking. The widow was initially reserved, but gradually warmed to Sarah's company. Been a while since we had a proper lady in Luna, Mrs. Caldwell commented on the second evening as they shelled peas together. Most women passing through are, well, not the sort one invites to dinner. Luna seems like a pleasant enough town, Sarah replied diplomatically. Small but orderly. Mrs. Caldwell snorted. Orderly now, perhaps. Wasn't always so. Before Sheriff Hogan came 5 years back, this place was as wild as any in the territory. She eyed Sarah curiously. Your Mr. Owens seems a decent sort for a bounty hunter. He's not my Mr. Owens, Sarah corrected, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. He's simply helping me reach my destination. Hum, Mrs. Caldwell hummed skeptically. Well, he looks at you like you're water in the desert, if you'll pardon my saying so. Sarah's hands stilled over the peas. We've only known each other a few days. Time moves differently out here, the widow replied with a knowing smile. Life's too harsh to waste on slow courtships. When you find someone worth riding with, you hold on tight. Sarah pondered the older woman's words as she retired to her room that night. Was there truth in what Mrs. Caldwell had observed? Mason had been nothing but respectful, yet Sarah couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them with surprising speed. She took out the compass he'd given her, running her thumb over its worn brass case. The needle pointed steadily north, unwavering in its purpose. Like Mason himself, the third day dawned bright and clear, but as the hours passed with no sign of Mason, Sarah's anxiety grew. By dusk, she found herself standing on the boarding house porch, straining to see any movement on the road leading into town. "He'll come, dear, Mrs. Caldwell said, bringing Sarah a shawl against the evening chill. "Men like him keep their word." "Yes," Sarah agreed, though worry gnawed at her. "But what if something's happened to him?" The widow patted her shoulder sympathetically. "Then you'll do what women out here always do. You'll move forward and make the best life you can." She hesitated, then added, "The stage comes tomorrow. You should decide if you're boarding it." Sarah nodded absently, her eyes still fixed on the empty road. "I'll decide in the morning." She stayed on the porch until the last light faded from the sky, then reluctantly returned to her room. Sleep eluded her as she listened for hoofbeats that didn't come. Dawn was just breaking when Sarah heard a commotion in the street below. She rushed to the window to see a horse and rider moving slowly toward the boarding house. Even in the dim light, she recognized Samson's distinctive gait. Not pausing to dress properly, Sarah threw a shawl over her nightgown and raced downstairs and out into the street. Mason was dismounting stiffly, his face grimy with dust and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Mr. Owens," she called, hurrying toward him. Mason turned at her voice, and the tight lines of his face softened momentarily before he staggered, catching himself against Samson's side. Sarah reached him just as his knees began to buckle, ducking under his arm to support him. "You're hurt," she said, noting the dark stain spreading across his left side. "Mrs. Caldwell, help please." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The town doctor was summoned, and Mason was carried to a room in the boarding house. The wound, a bullet graze along his ribs, was cleaned and stitched while Sarah paced anxiously in the hallway. "He'll be fine," the doctor assured her as he emerged. "Lost some blood, but it's a clean wound." "Fever's the main concern now." "May I sit with him?" Sarah asked, already moving toward the door. The doctor nodded. "Keep him cool and try to get water into him when he wakes. I'll check back this evening." Mason lay pale and still against the pillows, his usual vigor subdued by pain and blood loss. Sarah settled into a chair beside the bed, dipping a cloth in cool water to bathe his forehead. "You came back," she murmured, though she knew he couldn't hear her. "Just as you promised." Throughout the day, Mason drifted in and out of consciousness. During one lucid moment, he caught Sarah's hand as she adjusted his blankets. "The woman," he said, his voice rough, "got her away from them. She's safe." Sarah soothed. "Rest now. You can tell me everything later." "3 of them dead," Mason continued, as if compelled to report. "Decker got away, but he's wounded, won't get far." "You've done enough," Sarah assured him, gently pressing him back against the pillows. "More than enough." Mason's eyes, fever bright, fixed on her face. "Thought I might not see you again," he admitted, his usual reserve stripped away by exhaustion and pain. "Kept thinking about that as I rode back." Sarah's heart quickened at his words. "I knew you would return," she told him, squeezing his hand. "Now rest so you can heal." The stage departed the next day without Sarah. She sent a letter to her sister explaining the delay and promising to arrive as soon as circumstances permitted. Catherine would worry, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave Mason while he recovered. For 3 days, Sarah barely left Mason's side, reading to him when he was awake, changing his bandages, and ensuring he took the medicines the doctor prescribed. On the fourth day, his fever finally broke, and he woke with clear eyes and a hearty appetite. "You should be in Tahlequah by now," he observed as Sarah brought him a tray with breakfast, "and leave you to Mrs. Caldwell's tender mercies." "I think not," Sarah smiled, settling into her usual chair. "Besides, the next stage isn't for 3 more days. By then, you should be well enough to travel if you still wish to accompany me." Mason studied her face, noting the shadows of fatigue beneath her eyes. "You've been taking care of me all this time." "Someone had to," Sarah replied lightly. "You saved my life, remember." It seemed only fair to return the favor. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "I remember finding a half-dead woman in the desert. Hardly seems the same as nursing a man through a bullet wound." "Well, I suppose we'll have to disagree on that point." Sarah poured him a cup of coffee. "Now, when you're feeling stronger, I'd like to hear what happened with the Deckers." Mason's expression darkened. "It wasn't pretty. They'd holed up in an abandoned mining camp in the foothills. The hostage, her name was Clara, was being kept in one of the shacks." He took a sip of coffee. "I waited until nightfall, then moved in. Managed to free her, but they woke up before we could get clear. There was a gunfight." "And you were shot?" Sarah prompted gently when he fell silent. Mason nodded. "One of them got lucky. I got luckier. It could have been worse. 3 of them won't be troubling anyone again, but Decker himself escaped, though he took a bullet too." His eyes met hers. "Clara's safe, though. I got her to an army patrol before heading back here." "You did a brave thing," Sarah said softly. "That woman owes you her life, as do I." Mason looked uncomfortable with her praise. "Just doing what needed doing." He hesitated, then added, "But I'm glad I made it back to you." The simple honesty in his voice made Sarah's heart flutter. "So am I," she replied. As Mason regained his strength over the next few days, their relationship deepened. They spent long hours in conversation, sharing the stories of their lives that had previously been only hinted at. Mason spoke of his childhood in Tennessee, his brief, happy marriage to Alina, and the darkness that had followed her death. Sarah told him of her girlhood in Virginia, the fiancé she'd lost to war, and her years caring for her ailing father. "I've never told anyone so much about myself," Mason admitted one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson. "Not in all these years." "Perhaps it was time," Sarah suggested. "For both of us." Mason nodded slowly. "Perhaps it was." By the time the next stagecoach arrived in Luna, Mason was well enough to travel, though the doctor advised against hard riding for at least another week. They secured passage on the stage, continuing their journey east with a new understanding between them, unspoken but profound. The stagecoach route took them through increasingly settled country as they moved east, crossing into Texas and then north toward the Indian Territory. Along the way, they stopped in towns larger than Luna, where Sarah was able to purchase new clothing and personal items to replace what she'd lost. In one such town, Amarillo, they enjoyed their first proper restaurant meal together. Seated across from Mason in a clean dress, her hair arranged neatly for the first time since he'd found her, Sarah was suddenly conscious of how far they'd come from that first desperate meeting in the desert. "You look beautiful," Mason said quietly, catching her off guard. It was the first time he'd commented on her appearance. Sarah felt herself blush. "Thank you. It feels good to be civilized again." "I don't know," Mason replied with a rare, teasing smile. "You looked mighty determined, even covered in dust and half dead from thirst." "A woman can be both determined and presentable, Mr. Owens," Sarah retorted, returning his smile. "Mason," he said suddenly, After all we've been through, I think you might call me Mason." "Mason," Sarah repeated, liking the way his name felt on her lips. "And you must call me Sarah." "Sarah," he agreed, his eyes warm as they held hers across the table. That night, as they walked back to their hotel under a canopy of stars, Mason's hand brushed against hers. Without thinking, Sarah linked her fingers with his. He glanced down at their joined hands, then back at her face, a question in his eyes. "I don't want to presume," he said carefully. "You're not," Sarah assured him, squeezing his hand gently. They walked in silence for a moment, both acutely aware of this shift in their relationship. When they reached the hotel, Mason hesitated before bidding her good night. "I never expected to find you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Out there in that desert, I never expected any of this." "Nor did I," Sarah replied, "but I'm grateful for it, for you." Mason's hand came up to touch her cheek gently. "May I?" He began, then stopped, uncertain. Sarah answered by rising on her toes and pressing her lips softly to his. The kiss was brief, but filled with promise, a beginning rather than an ending. "Good night, Mason," she whispered as she drew back. "Good night, Sarah," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. The next morning brought a new ease between them as they continued their journey. Days passed in conversation and shared observations of the changing landscape. Nights were marked by increasingly tender moments, hands held, gentle kisses, the gradual dismantling of barriers built over years of solitude. As they crossed into the Indian Territory, the land grew more verdant, the desert giving way to rolling hills and forests. They were less than a week from Tahlequah now, and both felt the approaching crossroads in their relationship. "What will you do after you've delivered me to my sister?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat by a creek where the stagecoach had stopped to rest the horses. Mason skipped a stone across the water's surface. "I've been thinking about that. And I'm not sure going back to bounty hunting feels right anymore." He looked at her directly. "Not if it means leaving you behind." Sarah's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead. "What are you saying, Mason?" "I'm saying that I care for you, Sarah, more than I thought possible after a leaner." He took her hand in his. "These past weeks with you have shown me that there might be more to life than just surviving." "I care for you too," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But my plans, my sister's family—" "I'm not asking you to change your plans," Mason assured her. "Only to consider whether there might be room in them for me." Sarah looked up at him, this man who had found her dying and had given his water to save her life, who had risked himself to avenge the attack on her stagecoach, who had shown her kindness, respect, and eventually, affection. "There is," she said firmly. "There is room for you, Mason, if you want it." The smile that lit his face was like sunrise breaking over the desert, rare and breathtaking. "I do want it, Sarah, more than anything." Tahlequah appeared on the horizon 6 weeks after Mason had first found Sarah in the desert. The small but prosperous town served as the capital of the Cherokee Nation, with neat buildings lining its main street and the Cherokee National Capital standing proudly at its center. The stagecoach let them off in front of the Tahlequah Hotel, where Sarah immediately inquired after the Preston residence. The clerk directed them to a handsome 2-story house on a tree-lined street at the edge of town. "Are you nervous?" Mason asked as they walked the short distance, Sarah clutching his arm. "A little," she admitted. "It's been 5 years since I've seen my sister, and I'm arriving with—" She gestured between them. "Well, with unexpected news." Mason squeezed her hand reassuringly. "We'll take it one step at a time." The Preston home was exactly as Catherine had described in her letters, a spacious house with a wide porch and a garden blooming with summer flowers. Sarah hesitated at the gate, suddenly overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her here. "Ready?" Mason asked gently. Sarah nodded, drawing a deep breath. Ready. Before they could knock, the front door flew open and a woman who could only be Catherine, sharing Sarah's blue eyes and fair coloring, rushed down the steps. Sarah. Oh my God, Sarah. She cried, enveloping her sister in a fierce embrace. We've been so worried. Your letter from Luna arrived, but then nothing for weeks. Sarah returned the embrace, tears filling her eyes. I'm sorry to have worried you, Kathy. The journey took longer than expected. Catherine drew back, noticing Mason for the first time. Her eyes widened questioningly. Catherine, this is Mason Owens, Sarah introduced, a smile lighting her face. The man who saved my life in the desert and... She looked up at him, love evident in her expression. The man I intend to marry if he'll have me. Mason's face registered surprise, then joy. If I'll have you, Sarah, that's all I want in this world. Catherine looked between them, astonishment giving way to understanding. Well, she said, a smile spreading across her face, it seems we have much to celebrate. Come inside, both of you. William and the children will be overjoyed to meet you, all the more so now. As they followed Catherine into the house that was to have been Sarah's new home, Mason leaned close to whisper in Sarah's ear. Did you mean that? About marrying me? Sarah turned to face him, her eyes shining with certainty. With all my heart. You found me when I was lost, Mason. You traded your water to save my life. Now I want to share that life with you wherever it leads us. Mason's hand found hers, squeezing gently. I'll never let you get lost again, he promised. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Sarah and Mason were married in the garden of the Preston home. The ceremony was small but joyful, with Catherine and William standing witness alongside their children, who had quickly grown attached to their new uncle. After the wedding, Mason surprised Sarah with news that he had purchased land just outside Tahlequah, a small ranch where they could raise horses, combining his skill with animals and her family's pre-war expertise. Our own place, Sarah marveled as they rode out to see it the day after their wedding, where we can build a life together. It needs work, Mason cautioned as the simple cabin came into view, but the land is good and there's water year-round. Sarah dismounted, turning in a slow circle to take in the rolling meadows and the distant line of trees. It's perfect, she declared. Our own piece of paradise. Mason wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. Not quite as dramatic as our first meeting, he teased. No desperate water rationing required. Sarah leaned back against him, content. I think we've had enough drama to last a lifetime, though I'll never forget what you said that day. What was that? You said, I'll trade my water before I lose you, Sarah reminded him, turning in his arms to face him. And you meant it. Best trade I ever made, Mason murmured, lowering his head to kiss his wife as the sun set over their new beginning. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming known throughout the territory for its fine horses. Sarah and Mason welcomed their first child, a son they named James, 2 years after their wedding. A daughter, Eleanor, named for Mason's first wife, with a generosity of spirit that touched him deeply, followed 18 months later. Mason never returned to bounty hunting, finding greater satisfaction in building something rather than tracking men for destruction. He still maintained his skills with firearms and tracking, teaching both Sarah and, eventually, their children the arts of survival in a sometimes harsh land. Word reached them occasionally about the Decker gang. The leader had eventually been captured in Colorado and hanged for his crimes. Mason received the news with quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back those who had been lost. On the 5th anniversary of the day Mason had found Sarah in the desert, They rode together to a hilltop overlooking their ranch. Below them, the cabin had expanded into a proper home, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Children's laughter drifted up from where James and Alina played under Catherine's watchful eye while she visited from town. "Did you ever imagine this?" Sarah asked, gesturing to the life they had built. "That day when you spotted me through your spyglass," Mason shook his head, a smile softening his weathered features. "Never. I was just trying to keep you alive for one more day." "And instead, you gave me a lifetime," Sarah replied, taking his hand in hers. "Our lifetime." As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in the same colors that had witnessed their first meeting, Mason drew his wife into his arms. Against all odds, they had found each other in the vast emptiness of the desert. Against all reason, they had built a love strong enough to withstand any hardship. And in doing so, they had created not just a home, but a legacy of love that would endure long after them. "I'd still trade my water for you," Mason whispered against her hair. "Every single day." Sarah smiled, secure in the certainty of his love and the life they had forged together. "I know," she replied simply, "but now we have enough for both of us and more to share." And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all.